could we be given warning at the beginning of a programme if there's going to be anything about the Beatles, as all Beatle fans can make sure to listen, and have a chance to ring up other fans to make sure they are also listening.
Hi everybody, this is John here. This is Paul, George,
and Ringo.
And we're very happy to be on your program once again.
Hello everyone, I'm your host and Beatles News guy Steve Marinucci with your latest Beatles News Brief podcast. In our last show, number 94, we reviewed the movie 1-to-1 John and Yoko. This time we'll review another film, Daytime Revolution, that came out last year, and we'll compare it to 1-to-1. We'll also add two more opinions to the discussion about the Canadian Beatles Decca tapes reel, and we'll close with some Beatles News Briefs. But our headliner is a deep and lively discussion on the history of Vee-Jay Records and the Beatles' connection to it, with two people very qualified to discuss the songs, pictures, and stories of the Beatles on Vee-Jay. The first is Michele Marotta, the daughter of Randy Wood, who was then president of Vee-Jay Records. He was involved with not only the Beatles releases on the label, but also that of the Four Seasons. Michele will relate stories about seeing and meeting the Beatles and some inside tales of how she was involved with the records the Beatles released on the label. The second is Beatles author and historian Bruce Spizer, who has written many books about the Beatles' history and the labels that released their records. His very first was the Beatles Records on Vee-Jay, an authoritative book when it was first released in hardback and has since been updated digitally. Bruce knows all when it comes to the labels of the Beatles. Here's my talk with Michele and Bruce. I'm very thrilled to introduce our two guests today. First, there's Michele Marotta, who is the daughter of Randy Wood, who was the president of Vee-Jay Records when the Beatles were on the label. And we're going to talk all about the label. And then my other guest is the very esteemed author Bruce Spizer, author of a zillion books on the Beatles albums and labels, who just informed me that the Vee-Jay Records book, which is the one I've been referring to for background, was his very first book. I didn't know that, Bruce.
Yes, that was the one that started it all. It was going to be a footnote in Beatles history titled The Beatles Records on Vee-Jay. And I thought that would be it. And all of a sudden the book came out and people were like, well, that's great. When is your book on Capitol Records coming out? And while I was writing those books, people were like, well, and of course you have to write about a book on the Apple records. So you kind of get the idea of how these things go.
Yeah. Michele, introduce yourself to everybody. You're Randy Wood's daughter.
I am his oldest living daughter.
Okay.
My earliest memories, it goes before Vee-Jay. Apparently my dad's best friend was Pete Seeger, who got him into the music industry. But with Vee-Jay, my earliest memory is actually Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons.
Which your dad brought to the label, correct?
Yeah, he brought it to the label.
Frankie Valli contacted him personally from what I was reading. Is that correct?
You know what? I couldn't tell you.
Okay.
I honestly just don't know. But
do you know that? Did Frankie Valli contact Randy Wood?
That's possible, but I can tell you Capitol Records turned down the Four Seasons.
Didn't they turn down the Beatles too?
Well, I was going to say they were good at turning down groups with 4 male singers.
Okay. Yeah. But anyway, Michele, so they started with the Four Seasons, and then they picked up the Beatles, and we
need to give it a little bit of context because, not everyone out there knows about Vee-Jay Records. Vee-Jay Records was a gospel R&B label,
right,
that was based in Chicago. And so they had some success with artists like Jimmy Reed and the Spaniels. And then all of a sudden they had what were called crossover hits. When I say success, on the R&B charts. And then you had Raindrops by Dee Clark. And then you had Duke of Earl by Gene Chandler. And what this showed was that you could make a lot more money if you weren't limited to the R&B market and if you could cross over into the more lucrative pop market, which essentially, since the majority of the population of the United States was white, that was the market you were going to. And Vee-Jay also began to think that, we know now that black people will buy black records, and we know white people will buy black records. And they figured out, white people will buy artists by white, right? Recording artists, white people. Okay, it makes sense. And so by picking up the Four Seasons, that gave them a band that certainly white people would be interested in. But because the record was on Vee-Jay and because Frankie Valli's falsettos were so unique, a lot of the black stations assumed that the Four Seasons were black recording artists. So that helped get the Four Seasons not only getting airplay on white stations and top 40, records, but also the R&B stations as well. So that was something that helped out Vee-Jay. And the other thing was at the same time they were releasing the Four Seasons, they also put out a record by a British artist who was actually from Australia, a guy named Frank Ifield.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened there was, you have to understand how Capitol Records work. Capitol Records, by that time, by the late 50s, was bought out by EMI, which was the world's largest recording organization. So Capitol was owned primarily by EMI, and that gave Capitol the right of first refusal for EMI product throughout the world. Any artist anywhere in the world, Capitol had a right of first refusal. There was a guy working for Capitol named Dave Dexter, and Dexter would review foreign product and then make a decision to put it out. And so Dexter, would put out things like Cliff Richards, and it wouldn't sell. And so, okay, well, that's not selling. So, why bother with the next thing? Nothing seemed to work for him. The only thing that worked for him that sold really well was Laurie London's He's Got the Whole World in His Hands. And so the idea was, well, occasionally we put out the records, they don't sell. So when he was offered Frank Ifield on the Columbia label out of the UK, he turned it down, and Vee-Jay put it out. Vee-Jay was fortunate enough to have the same attorney as EMI in the States. And so a guy named Paul Marshall offered the record, Frank Ifield's I Remember You, to Vee-Jay. They had a licensing deal for 5 years on it. They also had a right of first refusal for other Ifield recordings. They put it out. It got to number 5 on the charts nationally. That was a pretty big deal. Mm-hmm. And so when Capitol and other companies turned down Vee-Jay's Please Please Me, Let Me Do had been turned down by Capitol, and that was no big deal at the time because the Beatles weren't very big in the UK and EMI didn't really believe in it. But after it got to 17, they realized, gee, maybe there is something to this group, the Beatles. So when Capitol and everyone else in the States turned down Please Please Me, Paul Marshall suggested to Ewart Abner, who was the president of Vee-Jay at the time, why don't you take this record and see what happens? So Vee-Jay put out Please Please Me, and it sold maybe at most about 5,000 units, but that's how it all got started.
What's interesting is that the Beatles did I Remember You, Paul did I Remember You in Hamburg. And has it ever been determined how they came across that? Because that was before they were on Vee-Jay.
Well, I Remember You was a #1 hit in the UK. So
okay.
They would have been very familiar with the song.
Okay.
And at the time in their stage show, they wanted to show that not only could they do a couple of originals and all the great R&B classics from the States dating back to the mid-50s, but they also could do contemporary songs. They were basically like a cover band with a couple of originals. So doing the big hit, Frank Ifield's I Remember You, was, nothing any different than them doing Bobby V's Take Good Care of My Baby.
Okay. Michele, when did you first hear of the Beatles?
It was 1963, because I remember my parents talking about them. I believe that's when Introducing the Beatles first came out.
That was actually 64, I believe, right, Bruce?
Early January of 64.
Right.
So to put it in context, Michele, Please Please Me would have come out on February 7th, more or less, 1963, which ironically would be exactly a year before the Beatles landed at JFK Airport to invade America. And then From Me to You would have come out probably in about April of 64.
You've got to remember,
63, I mean. Yeah, 63.
I was young.
So were we
When I
all.
was young, that was an animal song, Michelle. We're talking
Right.
about the Beatles.
But I also
That's
have hay
right.
fever. But I remember, the sepia cover. And my mom and I would spend hours talking about, I can't even say it with a straight face, how long their hair was. And we couldn't tell them apart.
Really?
Well,
Yeah,
it was early 60s.
yeah, and the hair on introducing the Beatles was from a photo session in, about January of 63, and their hair's pretty short on that album cover picture. So it wasn't like the radically long hair of Meet the Beatles.
Right. Or later. So they first came into your life around in 63.
Mhm.
Was the Hollywood Bowl the first time you actually saw them? Did you see them in person at any kind of an event before that?
No, I was at the Hollywood Bowl concert,
Mm-hmm.
and in a weird world, I'm meeting people now because I'm working with another band who were at that same concert in the box seats, where we were,
Mm-hmm.
which is so weird. But I met them there. It was like a half-hour concert. It wasn't that long.
Right.
But, my dad's car was destroyed because people thought they were in his car. But we went to the Cinnamon Cinder and I met them there. And
You actually talked to them there.
yeah, and I remember saying,
Put that
God, they're
quickly
really
in
old.
context. There was a press conference, and when the Beatles were, I mean, it's hard to imagine this in today's world, but anytime the Beatles went anywhere in the States, they had a press conference in that city.
Right.
And so the one for the LA Hollywood Bowl concert, as Michelle was saying, was at the Cinnamon Cinder, and her father was there to not only rub hands with everyone, but also to present the Beatles with in-house record awards. Michelle will talk about that in a second. But the RIAA, the Recording Industry Association of America, did not issue gold records for the Beatles because Vee-Jay did not submit to have their records, accounting records, verified by the accountants for the Recording Industry Association of America. But they gave in-house gold records awards, and there are wonderful pictures of Randy Wood handing all these awards to John Lennon.
Right. You have two, I saw two in your book. One they're both with John and also Derek Taylor. Derek Taylor. Is Derek Taylor in both of them? I think he is.
I believe he is. But the story, Michelle, that you told me that I'd love for you to tell the listeners here is when you and I believe some of your siblings discovered these gold record awards prior to their presentation.
Oh, yeah, we were doing what we weren't supposed to do, rummaging through my parents' closet. And we found them. So our fingerprints are all over these gold records. And you can see the fingerprints on some of the photos. Actually, I have a photo here.
We've all seen that picture before. That's the one that's in my book of Randy Wood presenting it to John Lennon.
Do you remember anything else about that press conference?
Kind of. I remember it was really crowded, but now when I look at pictures, it wasn't that crowded. My Uncle Pat was there. And just remember a lot of people. And there was another child my age there. That's really all I remember. My mom got both of us out of there quickly.
Oh, so you didn't talk to any of them?
I
Or
talked
did
to
you?
John. I talked to John for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember telling my dad, oh my God, these guys are really old, And I said they talked funny because they had that Cockney English accent.
Right. Right.
So
it was interesting because the gold record awards that were given in those days, gold records meant sales of 1 million units.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was reading Billboard, I mean, so it started to make sense at first because it said, well, the awards were for Please Please Me and Twist and Shout, Do You Want to Know a Secret, Love Me Do, and Tell Me Why. And I thought, well, the first four make sense, but Tell Me Why doesn't make any sense at all because Tell Me Why was a Beatles song Capitol had the rights to. And at first I thought, well, maybe it was for the album introducing the Beatles. But if you look at the awards, they're all the same size and they're small to the point of where an LP would not have fit. And then I realized Tell Me Why was not the correct title, but it must have been for Ask Me Why, which was issued on an EP, which sold nowhere near 1 million units. So I think that was wishful thinking on the part of Vee-Jay, but the first four certainly did have sales in that range. And back in 2016, all those many years ago, I actually got the accounting information from Vee-Jay, the actual green ledger sheets and everything from a woman, Betty Chapetta, and she was the former controller of Vee-Jay, and she had just put all that stuff in storage. And I met with the RIAA's CPA firm in New York after being sponsored by Capitol Records, brought them the green ledger sheets, which almost no one at that firm had ever seen before, except for the managing partner who knew what a ledger sheet was. They were all looking for Excel spreadsheets. And we were able to certify that Please Please Me, Twist and Shout, and Love Me Do, and also introducing the Beatles, had sales of over 1 million units. Do You Want to Know a Secret? We certified sales of about 925,000, although it clearly did sell over 1 million. But what Vee-Jay was doing in those days, because royalties were based on actual sales, they would do a deal where they would say, buy 10, get one free, or buy 9, get one free. So if you factor in the so-called free records that they didn't pay royalties on, they clearly sold over 1 million of Do You Want to Know a Secret?
Yeah.
But anyway, what it means is that those 5 records I mentioned, Please Please Me, Twist and Shout, Do You Want to Know a Secret, Love Me Do, and Introducing the Beatles were all certified gold, and all but Do You Want to Know a Secret was certified platinum, meaning sales of over 1 million units. And that was done in 2016.
Now, if you look at this,
Well, but on radio,
They can't see it, but we can describe it. Go ahead, Michele.
okay, these are Tolly records. They're not Vee-Jay, but Tolly was a subsidiary.
Yeah, well, the first one that's being shown is Twist and Shout, which indeed was on the Tolly subsidiary, as was Love Me Do. And then Please Please Me and Do You Want to Know a Secret were on Vee-Jay. The story behind that's interesting. If you think about what was going on in January of 1964, Capitol by that time has I Want to Hold Your Hand Out, which came out the day after Christmas in 63. Vee-Jay re-releases Please Please Me and puts From Me to You on the B-side. Swan starts marketing She Loves You, which they had put out in September of 63 and it flopped. And then MGM gets the rights to, My Bonnie and puts that out. So you've got 4 different labels with Beatle Records. And Vee-Jay, in the meantime, wants to rush out a new single, Twist and Shout, and doesn't want to confuse DJs, who already are dealing with Capitol and Vee-Jay and Swan and MGM. So what they do is they create a subsidiary label, Tolly, specifically for Love Me Do. And then they began issuing other records on Tolly that are more rock-oriented as opposed to R&B. And then when they put out their next Beatles record, Do You Want to Know a Secret, they put that out on Vee-Jay. And then when they put out Love Me Do a month later, that's back on Tolly. So that's why you see those labels flip-flopping back and forth. It was marketing. And as Michele, who I can see her on the image I'm looking at, is nodding her head, Vee-Jay was extremely good at marketing. This company had the rights to 16 Beatle masters, and through the creativity of Randy Wood and others, managed to release 16 different records with Beatles songs on it, with only 16 Beatle masters to begin with.
Yeah, I have to say, let me interrupt. Well, I have issues with my father, but he could take nothing and make $1 million. He was incredible at marketing. And I don't know how he did it. And I wish I had even part of that skill.
Yeah, Jay Lasker was also very good at that. He was part of the...
Yeah, Uncle Jay was incredible. And, I still talk to Marcy, his daughter. But Jay Lasker went on to be the first white Jewish guy to head Motown. Yeah. And I was devastated when he died, 15, 20 years ago?
There was a lot of connection there. Ewart Abner also later on went on to do some work for Motown as well.
Yeah. And, of course, Vivian and Jimmy Bracken.
Yeah.
Or Carter.
Yeah.
Vivian.
Yeah, that was why the label was called Vee-Jay, Vivian James.
Vivian and Jimmy.
That's a good little anecdote there.
And Tolly was, I think, their nephew.
But what it was you had Ewart Abner was the president. Then you had, of course, James and Vivian Bracken, and the head of A&R. Oh man, I'm blanking on his name. Who was the other name I'm missing,
Oh
Michelle?
my God, there's Steve Clark, Bob DeMaine,
It was,
and
I believe it was Vivian's brother who was doing the A&R work for them.
I don't remember his name. It's like,
Yeah, it was Calvin Carter.
that's it.
And Calvin Carter's middle name was Tolly. And if
Really?
you look
Oh.
at, yes. And so Tolly Records was his middle name, and he also had a son named Tolly. And that's where they got Tolly from. And if you look at VJ's publishing companies, the publishing companies would take the middle name of somebody. So that was not really unusual. And that's how they came up with Tolly. It was strictly Calvin Carter's middle name. And he was head of A&R for VJ.
Yeah, and I spoke to Tolly maybe 15 years ago.
Yeah, me too, around 20 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, he teaches finance, I guess.
He's still alive.
Well, he was 20 years ago.
And he could tell his class that a label whose first release sold over 1 million copies was named after him.
Yeah, he could.
Michelle, you saw them in '66 at Dodger Stadium, but you did not go to '65. You know why you guys didn't go to see him in '65?
I have no clue. My
Don't
mom
have
took us all to overnight camp, so
Oh,
I
okay.
don't know.
What do you remember about '66?
Mm. Okay, my cousin and I wore our mini skirts,
Okay.
and we made those triangle banners. You know,
Okay.
one said Paul, hers said, I don't remember. But there was a lot of screaming. We still couldn't hear anybody.
How far back were you sitting at both of the shows?
We're in the box seats at the Hollywood Bowl.
Okay.
At the time, it was the stage, the orchestra pit, a pool, box seats.
So you were right up in front.
Pool's no longer there, and the pool has added box seats.
Yeah, but at the Hollywood Bowl concert, I mean, security got us out. There were girls like running up and jumping in the pool and tearing their clothes off. And
When did they get rid of the pool, Bruce?
I don't know exactly when that was.
Because I seem to recall when I saw Paul McCartney there, and I seem to remember that the pool was there then. Maybe I could be wrong though.
They had the orchestra pit, but they no longer had the pool, as I recall it.
Okay.
yeah, but yeah, that I remember. Now for the Dodger Stadium show, we were second tier.
Okay.
I've only been to Dodger Stadium 3 times, so
And you said either time you couldn't really hear him, right?
not at all, no.
Hmm.
You know, the first time there was so much screaming, and basically both. But Dodger Stadium's acoustics were not the best then.
Could you see them very well?
I had binoculars.
Okay. The second time or
Yes.
both times?
Second time.
Just the second time. How close? So you could see them well the first time, but the second time you had to use binoculars.
We had to use binoculars. We were very far up. I'm trying to remember because I was 66, I was 12. And I remember I wanted to look just like Jane Asher.
That was your
Okay.
plan, to get Paul to fall madly in love with you?
Yes, me, a 12-year-old from the Bronx.
Wow. Wow.
It didn't happen. But yeah, that's really what I remember. We didn't go by limo this time. My dad drove.
I remember you telling me a story about some of the assembly work for the records was done in your house. Is that right? Am I right about that?
We bootlegged our own albums.
There you go.
After 1964, that is.
True. And apparently my brother-in-law told me they would do the same assembly in New York in his apartment.
VJ had the rights to the Beatles under a licensing agreement for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the first record they put out under the agreement was Please Please Me. Then they put out From Me to You. They did not put out Introducing the Beatles in the summer of '63, even though that was used to be in every book on the Beatles. Vee-Jay ran out of money.
Yeah.
And so EMI unilaterally terminated its agreement with Vee-Jay. We could do a whole show on that, Steve, but to cut to the chase, they settled the litigation between the companies, and under the litigation, Vee-Jay had the rights to the Beatles through October 15th of 1964, at which time it expired. Prior to that time, they had to pay royalties directly to Capitol Records. And so in October of 64, that was it. And therefore, that meant if you went to a record store in the early 1970s and were buying copies of Introducing the Beatles on Vee-Jay, they were not legitimate. What we didn't know when we were buying these records was who was behind those West Coast albums. And Michele personally went, and we'll talk about that.
Go ahead, Michele.
Oh God, it was set up in our living room with card tables.
Mm-hmm.
And we would stick stickers on that said stereo and reissue. And that was basically how we did it. Or we'd go into, I don't remember where they were. I don't know if they were in the Playboy building or in Santa Monica Boulevard. And we'd do it there. And, like I was 14, 15. I didn't care. And I didn't know. I had no clue. To me, it was like, oh boy, I'm in the record business. But I didn't know we were bootlegging our own albums.
Yeah,
And I think
Vee-Jay was not just the Beatles, that was primary, but also Gene Chandler was also getting bootlegged as well.
that I didn't know, but I know with the
Some
Beatles,
Gene Chandler ones that clearly look very similar to the 1970s Vee-Jay Introducing the Beatles that were, politely said, counterfeited would be more accurate, actually.
right. But with the Beatles, we had Introducing the Beatles, the two Beatle albums.
Right.
Yeah, the
Vee-Jay-
Beatles and Frank Ifield, you all were doing that as well.
Yeah, we had that. We had the Beatles versus the Four Seasons.
Yeah, I never saw that bootleg though. I remember seeing that legitimately, of course, but if y'all did bootleg it, it wasn't in massive numbers like Introducing the Beatles and the Beatles and
Right.
Frank Ifield.
I remember Ifield a lot. That was one I remember seeing. Another thing that they did, and this is actually not, I don't think this is bootleg, is that Vee-Jay put stickers on the top of songs, pictures, and stories to promote the upcoming, or I assume it was the upcoming concerts.
Yeah.
No, I'll give you the story on that.
Okay.
Once again, the brilliance of Vee-Jay marketing, and probably Jay Lasker's idea, but could have been Randy's. What they did was first of all, Introducing the Beatles itself, it reached a point where it sold about 1.2 million copies and it wasn't selling anymore. And that was in the spring of 64. And Vee-Jay knew they were not going to have any future Beatle albums to put out. One of the other things that was hurting it was the cover was not a very flattering photograph of the group. In the back of it, since they had lost the liners that EMI had sent them and couldn't ask for new ones, was boring. It just listed the names of the songs on each side.
Right.
Jay Lasker got the idea to put out what he described as a magazine cover. That album was called Songs, Pictures, and Stories of the Fabulous Beatles, and it was a gatefold cover, although the front flap of it was only 2/3, so that you had a picture of the Beatles on it and the title of the album, and then on the part that wasn't there, it had the four faces of the Beatles. When you opened it up, you also had information about each of the Beatles, like how much they weighed, what was their height, what was their favorite color, what was their favorite movies, what type of women did they like. You get the idea.
Yeah.
And they had that on that album. And if you bought that album, the record inside was Introducing the Beatles. And Capitol Records sued them for that and argued they couldn't do this. And actually, Capitol didn't get sued. Vee-Jay was told by Capitol and EMI they could not release that album. And actually, they sued to have the right to release it. And they won that because Vee-Jay had decent lawyers on that case. And Capitol argued that you can't do this. Your contract doesn't let you do, you can only put out the albums you had. And Vee-Jay said, that's all we're doing. We're putting out Introducing the Beatles in a new cover. And Capitol said, well, you can't do that. And Vee-Jay said, well, you do that all the time, Capitol. here's a Nat King Cole album with one cover, and here's that same album with a different cover. So a judge ruled in Vee-Jay's favor and said that since all they were doing was putting out introducing the Beatles in a new cover, that was okay. So that was the album that you were talking about, Steve. It was called Songs, Pictures, and Stories of the Fabulous Beatles.
Right.
So what they did was after the Beatles' appearances in the United States, they got stickers and what they called concert banners. These were not sold at the concerts. And these probably, and I mean, I know from the paperwork, this didn't happen until about October of 64. And so it'd be like, Vee-Jay was into souvenir things. So souvenir of that picture, the concert at the Hollywood Bowl, and that banner would say that in the date of the concert. Those will be sold in record stores in LA in October of 64. Souvenir of their appearance at City Park Stadium, New Orleans, September 16th, 1964. Sold in New Orleans record stores in October of 64, and so forth.
I've seen the one for the Cow Palace.
Yes, there's Cow Palace.
Yeah.
You know, we've confirmed about maybe a dozen of those. They did not do that for all cities, or if they did, they certainly have not turned up.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything like that. I actually didn't know that, but you're the expert.
Now, what Vee-Jay did do, and you probably put records into that one, they came up with an album, and, you know, they didn't want to spend the money in the 70s of that elaborate gatefold cover. So rather than it being Songs, Pictures, and Stories of the Beatles, they merely called it Songs and Pictures of the Beatles, and it was a single fold jacket. And you probably stuffed a few of those with introducing the Beatles back in the day, Michele.
I kind of remember that. I
Yeah.
remember both covers.
Yeah.
I actually have them here.
Which picture did you use on that Songs and Pictures one? Is it the same one?
It's the same. It looked like the front cover because remember that was a gatefold flap. But
Right.
as a single thing, you had the black background and the picture of the Beatles and the four faces.
You're talking about the
Because-
drawing. You're talking about the drawing one, the same one that you used on the cover of your book, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And you had the four faces that Vee-Jay used these four faces like about probably, I don't know, about 5 or 6 different releases. They used it on the Christmas sleeves that they did for October 64 to get
Yeah.
people to rebuy oldie series singles that people probably already had the songs on. It was great marketing.
Yeah, it was. I don't remember if we had any red or blue wax singles of them,
No,
but none.
no.
Okay.
But they were on the oldies label, which was a red label pressed on black vinyl. And
Oh, the
Vee-Jay
Afterpast?
rushed those. Yeah, Vee-Jay rushed those out,
hmm
and those were counterfeited in the 70s as well, of course.
I remember cassettes called Out of the Past.
Really?
Similar, yeah.
I don't remember seeing those.
I also have,
Oh. Unfortunately, we have to
Yeah.
describe them to you.
Yes.
will describe it, but
Dum dum dum. Yeah. We can't sing a Beatles song because.
Copyright.
Yeah, that's right.
bars, I think.
God. It's
Okay, you
terrible.
got, this is Vee-Jay, the Definitive Collection.
Right. That is a 4 CD collection that I highly recommend to people if you can find it. I don't know if it's still in print, but you can find it certainly on eBay and other sources in the secondary market. It is an excellent collection.
And the other one I have, which I haven't opened. Oh,
Is
Vee-Jay, it's great cars. It's just car music.
oh,
like-
okay. Interesting.
But this one, the Vee-Jay collection, I was working for a car guy and he walked in, he goes, "Oh my God, you're Michele." Okay. So he sent me 2 of them,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really?
my sister. But here's one of the CDs, which is, I'm holding it up.
Yeah, I was very familiar
Which-
with that. And if you can read a few of the song titles, these were the gospel and R&B songs that were on Vee-Jay. And, you know, so you're not going to get like all these Beatles and Four Seasons recordings on that set, but what you are going to get are Jimmy Reed, the Spaniels, you know, just wonderful
Butler.
music. Gene Chandler, of course.
Jerry Butler.
Yes, you
Love
would have
Jerry
some Jerry Butler. I'll like to hit on that as well.
Mhm.
The
Got
Pips,
Staples.
staple singers, yeah. They
And
started out as a gospel group.
Oh, I know. And then
It's
here we have disc 4, The Four Seasons.
yes. I don't
But
think
it,
they were able to license any Beatles on that set.
There's no Beatles on here.
Steve, if the RIAA gave out gold and platinum awards, introducing the Beatles counterfeit version would probably be what we would call platinum 4X, meaning sales of 4 million copies.
I know they got bought by Concord Music a couple of years ago. Bruce, or Michelle, actually, you probably know about that too.
All I know, I was told Paul McCartney owns part of Concord. I don't
Right.
know. Oh, he does. But I don't know a lot. I know Concord from being Concord Jazz, and I'm assuming it's the same company.
I believe it is, Bruce. That's right, isn't it?
I think so. And they haven't done that much with it. I mean, I think if people want to license the songs that Vee-Jay has the rights to, that would not be the Beatles or the Four Seasons, obviously. Those were lost in litigation. But if you're talking about, other types of acts on Vee-Jay, as we talked about the rhythm and blues and items and the gospel items, they would have that. And I'm sure that they're, I don't think they've actively put out much in the way of collections or anything, but as far as licensing goes for films, television shows, or people doing best of the 60s R&B and stuff like that, they would be, I think those would be licensed through Concord.
Yeah.
I think they have the masters.
Yeah, and the Beatles masters, going back to Vee-Jay, they were supposed to be destroyed.
Yes, they were. I have pieces of paper that say that. And Michelle, I got the impression, because they were pressing records in the 70s, they were not destroyed, those metal parts.
No, they were not.
That's why they sound pretty good. They're put in
And
from the metal, they're actually stamped from the metal parts. And I know that there was a pressing plant in LA, I'm blanking on the name of it, that pressed that stuff from Vee-Jay, into Capitol got involved and told them don't do that anymore.
it was either the record plant or Sound Factory, or maybe Gold Star or Four Star.
Yeah, but
No,
they
it
were,
was one of those, but I still see masters for sale on eBay.
yes, those did hit the secondary market. And, I just don't know. The average person buying it is not buying it to stamp Beatle singles. They're buying it for their collection as a collectible.
Right.
How
And
much?
I think the sad part of all this is that had they not gone astray, Vee-Jay in the summer of 63 would have had money to continue putting out records by the Beatles and the Four Seasons, would not have
Yeah.
owed royalties on the Beatles and Four Seasons, would not have had those contracts terminated. Even Vee-Jay already had a pretty strong artist roster full of black recording artists. Vee-Jay would have been bigger than Motown, because not only did they have the black artists, but they would have had two of the biggest white acts selling in America, the Four Seasons and the Beatles. It's possible that, rather than Vee-Jay continuing to put out Beatles product, they may have sold the rights to Capitol Records the same way that Sun Records sold the rights to Elvis Presley to RCA, which would have given them a lot of money. And, who knows what would have happened. So very talented people. It's a tragic story. It's not all that well known. It would make one hell of a documentary. If you're listening, Tom Hanks, and would like to consult me about it, I'll be happy to work with you on it. Michelle and I have been approached by individuals over the years to tell the Vee-Jay story. If anyone wants to do a legitimate documentary on Vee-Jay, we, of course, would be delighted to participate.
Michelle, what are you doing lately that people can see?
Okay, I'm still doing a lot of backup singing. I just signed a contract with a publishing company that I can't say. I'm working with Redbone 2.0.
Okay.
And I went back to my first career, which was actor and writer, and I'm doing red carpet photography under Studio City Now. I've got my YouTube channel, which is Studio City Now. I've got my podcast, which is Studio City Now.
Okay.
So that's what I'm doing, and it's supposed to be retired. I can't retire.
Okay. Bruce, I know you have a book out now that you've been selling, and you have one that's going on pre-order. Why don't you talk about that?
Just the short history. After doing the Beatles records on VJ, which is sold out and in the secondary market goes for hundreds of dollars, but there is a digital revised and expanded edition. My website is very easy to remember, Beatle, Beatle.net, N-E-T. So the VJ book, which is sold out, the Capitol Record books, part 1 and part 2, which cover the singles and the albums, those are sold out. And there's a digital versions of that available. The Beatles on Apple Records, both the group and the solo book, those are sold out. I have not done digital on those yet. I still have The Beatles Are Coming, which is my favorite book that tells the convoluted story of how Beatlemania evolved in America. It does have a lot of VJ stories in that book. So a lot of the things I've talked about today, you would know from that book. I did a book called The Beatles Swan Song, which covered the records on Swan, United Artists, MGM, just other kind of miscellaneous things, and the Capitol re-releases of the 70s and 80s. That book is sold out as well. And then the Beatles records on Parlophone, Beatles for Sale on Parlophone is how that one's titled. That is still available. It covers the British recordings and albums, singles, and EPs from the 60s. After that, I retired from writing Beatle books, still practicing law. And in 2017, wrote what was going to be an article for a magazine on Sgt. Pepper. And I realized the article was too long for your typical magazine, and it wasn't going to have the graphics I wanted. So for about 3 seconds, I thought I would put out a Sgt. Pepper magazine. And as soon as I thought that, I said, wait a minute, I don't know how to publish a magazine. I know how to publish a book. And so at that point in time, I put out a book, and that was going to be a book on Sgt. Pepper for the 50th anniversary called The Beatles and Sgt. Pepper, A Fan's Perspective. And after that book came out, people were like, Bruce, when's your White Album book coming out? So you get the idea. That begat an entire series of books called the Beatles Album Series. And what the books do is they take a particular album or grouping of albums and talk about how they were released in the United Kingdom, how they were released in the US. A buddy of mine, Pierce Hemmingson, writes about what was going on in Canada as well. I have Al Sussman, who is an editor at Beatle Fan magazine, write about what was going on in the world, what was going on in music. Frank Daniels writes about other things that were going on at the time. We also have the fan recollections, just like what they sound like. People write in, give us their stories. We put them in the book. And the final section in the book is detailed kind of who played what on each song and also how the songs were written and recorded. And that's essentially the latest in it. The current copy or the current book on it is called The Beatles, A Hard Day's Night and More. And the next book in the series will be Beatles for Sale to Help, which will be the ninth and final installment of that series. They're available in both PDF files through the website and also in hardcover books and special collector's editions. I encourage your listeners to go out to Beatle.net, check it out, see what you like, order a book, see what it is. I can assure you these are high quality books.
They are.
I want you won't buy more.
I have about half. Yeah.
You're taking pre-orders on Beatles for Sale to Help. Is that right?
That is correct.
It will ship in July, and the street date is August 11th.
Right. So if you order from the website, you'll get your book earlier. The collector's editions have some nice extra goodies. They're signed and numbered and limited to 500 total, signed and numbered. The book, like, for example, the book's called Beatles for Sale to Help. Well, that was the UK albums, but in the US, and it covers the US albums, Beatles 65, Beatles 6, and then the Help soundtrack album. It also covers the Beatles Story double LP. One of the projects I worked on recently for Capitol Records and Universal Music Group and Apple was they reissued the vinyl that came out in 64 in the US, such as Meet the Beatles' second album, the Beatles Stories, Something New, Beatles 65, and the early Beatles, which, although it came out in 65, had recordings from that were released originally on VJ, and we included that in the set. And each vinyl edition, of course, is on pristine 100, an 80-gram vinyl, and comes with an essay, and I wrote the essays for each of those albums.
Is the Beatles for Sale book the end of the story, or are you going to keep going?
I'm going to take a well-earned break. I don't
Good.
want to get like the Who and for the third time say this is the final book on the Beatles I've done, because I said that about the Beatles Song Swung, and then after the Parlophone book I said it. So and I don't want it to be Bruce Spizer's farewell book tour #5 or anything crazy like that. But I'm certainly going to take a break, and that may very well be the last hardcover book I do. I haven't decided.
Oh,
Okay.
you're going to keep writing. I mean, I know you well enough. You
Well,
cannot stop writing. So let me ask a question of both of you.
go ahead.
Steve, favorite Beatles song?
Favorite Beatles song is And Your Bird Can Sing.
Bruce?
It's like asking a parent who's your favorite child, but if you ask me my 3 favorite children Beatles songs, my favorite Beatles song mega hit, Hey Jude, my favorite well-known album track, In My Life, and my favorite obscure Beatles song, if there is such a thing, Across the Universe, but with a little footnote to that, any version of Across the Universe with the exception of the one on the Let It Be album.
Mm.
Okay. Michelle, your turn.
In My Life and Here, There, and Everywhere.
Well
Okay.
done.
Okay.
Yeah.
I actually have been thinking about something like that, asking at the end of interviews, asking a whole list of questions, like saying mono or stereo. Let me say that. Mono or stereo.
Stereo.
Stereo, except for the early albums, mono. But if they do have artificial intelligence, not to create anything new, but to use to separate the parts of the songs like we're done on the Red album, the reissue of that, that would be my favorite way to listen to them as opposed to the mono on those early ones, because I think that Giles Martin and Sam O'Kell and everybody and using Peter Jackson's technology to separate everything and quickly what in effect what they do is they can take a mono recording and teach artificial intelligence to separate John's voice by itself, to separate John's guitar, to pull out George's voice, Paul's voice, George's guitar, Paul's bass, Ringo's drums, Ringo's voice, and not only Ringo's drums, but Ringo's bass drum, Ringo's snare, Ringo's tom, Ringo's crash cymbal, and then put all that on separate tracks and remix them. And boy, I tell you what, that stuff sounds incredible, and I'm looking forward to more of those one day.
Yeah.
My answer to that question, believe it or not, is I like stereo on the early albums and more mono on like Sgt. Pepper and the White Album. But that whole discussion about AI and what they did and didn't do, Bruce, people are still confused over exactly what they
Let's
did.
real quick get that clear. It was
Okay.
marketed wrong when Now and Then came out. Oh, and AI. So people thought, oh, well, AI created John's voice. Wrong. John Lennon recorded the song Now and Then on a cassette player, and there was all kind of extraneous noises going on in the background.
Mhm.
And what artificial intelligence did was pull John Lennon's voice out all by itself. Paul duplicated John's piano part because John was a little bit off on it because he was mainly concentrating just on his vocal. And so Paul did the piano on that. Ringo laid down some new drums. George had laid down some stuff during the anthology sessions they were considering releasing Now and Then, but because the cassette sounded so terrible, they quit working on it. But what they did was not have a computer create anything. All the computer did was isolate John's voice so that they could then build a track around John's beautiful, pure voice. It was not a creation. So once you understand that, then I think you can go, oh, okay, that's fine. And I'm all fine with that. What I would not be fine with would be for them to say, the Beatles only had about 225 songs. Let's go ahead and make some new Beatles songs. AI, please make us a new Beatles song by John Lennon. I would be horrified by that.
There were things that got pulled out on social media that were using that conclusion and people went kind of nuts. But I'm glad you explained it because even after I first heard it, I wasn't sure exactly what they did. And it's nice to get a real explanation.
I was able to attend the listening session, screening session of it in New York, right when it was, going to be announced.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was just remarkable to hear it and then, have it explain, well, this is how, we did this and this. And when I saw that Peter Jackson video of Now and Then for the first time, on a nice big screen and a great sound system, it clearly brought tears to my eyes because on the part on the bridge of, now and then, I miss you. Well, that's Paul and Ringo singing that to John and George. And Peter Jackson's video visually shows what I was thinking in my head when I heard it. And then to see it, it was just remarkable. They had 3 different listening sessions that day. And because I had flown in from New Orleans, I attended all 3. And it brought tears to my eyes every time.
You just reminded me of one thing that I have to ask you. I talked to Piers Hemmingson a couple of weeks ago. He mentioned that at the Fest for Beatle Fans, he saw Peter Jackson talk about the Hamburg tapes and that Peter Jackson was doing something with the Hamburg tapes. I know you're limited in what you can say on anything, but I'm just going to ask your opinion. Would you think the Hamburg tapes would be a good project for them to deal with this on? To do something similar to what they did with Now and Then on? Would you be happy with that?
I would be very happy with that. I think what you have to understand about it is it's very hard to listen to the Hamburg Star Club's tape because it's a poor recording that hasn't aged well. They did the best they could with it under the technology of, the 1970s. But if you could isolate out all of those elements, I think it would be incredible. I think that the technology keeps getting better and better. And hopefully one day soon, while we're all still around, we will get the Hamburg recordings where AI was used, not to create anything, but to isolate everything to allow a proper mix. And I would love that.
Yeah, I would too. Listening to some of those recordings are just fantastic. I'm going to put you on the spot for one final question. We're coming to the anniversary of the anthology. Can we, I don't want to say can we expect, but is it possible that something's going to happen?
It's always possible that something will happen. I have not seen any schedule that shows that anthology is going to be repackaged at any time. So
They are redoing the book. They are republishing the book. That's listed on Amazon. So,
well, there are synergies in marketing, so one certainly cannot rule out anything being issued at that same time.
okay.
I have not seen anything on a schedule to say definitively, yes, that will happen.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Michele. This has been a great conversation from beginning to end. I thank both of you for taking the time. And what can I say? This has been great.
Yeah.
Bingo.
I
Michele, you want to say anything?
I learn a lot from Bruce. Because whenever I have a question, it's like, Bruce, he is the expert.
Yes, he is. He is. Again, thank both of you for doing this, and we will meet again.
Thank you.
I'm gonna pause the recording here. With One to One John and Yoko coming out last week, we decided to take a look at Daytime Revolution. If we were to compare it to One to One John and Yoko, I think Daytime Revolution is a much more cohesive film. The John clips aren't as detached from the narrative as they were in One to One. And Daytime Revolution incorporates more reaction from John in the programs from his week when he and Yoko co-hosted the Mike Douglas Show, which is the center of this film. The Mike Douglas Show, if you aren't aware, was a daytime fixture and extremely popular back in the days when John and Yoko co-hosted the show in 1972. And their week of co-hosting garnered huge ratings, as was expected. In his autobiography titled I'll Be Right Back, Mike Douglas said the show's idea was to present the real ballad of John and Yoko, which it certainly did through the various guests who appeared at John and Yoko's invitation. The most notable was John's hero Chuck Berry, who Lennon met for the first time during the week. But there were other notables as well, including comics George Carlin and Louis Nye, activist Ralph Nader, who manages to plug his website in the film, and Chicago 8 defendants Jerry Rubin and Bobby Seale, all of whom are shown in vintage clips from that week on the show. Douglas called Lennon a most benign, talented, and likable young man, also smart, funny, gregarious, and beguiling. He also said of Lennon, he was as good a listener as a talker, with a genuine compassion for other people and respect for other philosophies. About Yoko, he said, I think I came to understand something about John's affection for this woman. He calls her a powerful character, unswerving and unapologetic, about following her own unique path in life, and if you don't like it, too bad. Do your own thing, she's going to do hers. The film allows them both to express themselves. The Lennon music, of course, is just wonderful, though he also shows he was able to talk serious about issues at a time when he wasn't being taken that seriously by the older generation because of his radical views. Yoko is seen as the true individual that has always been her character and that John Lennon loved. One example of that was that the program shows her mend piece, which she does across 5 days. She rebuilds a broken teacup one piece at a time, 1 day at a time. John says that at times even he doesn't understand her, but her art was there for the viewing, and I think viewers in the day got a better idea of what her art was, even if they didn't totally appreciate it. In an interview we did with her in 1999, she told me one thing that she thought John liked about her art was its fun quality. She said, I think he was surprised that there was some sense of humor, because usually when he goes to art exhibits or something, he told me it was kind of too serious or angry or something. And she said, there's some kind of playful quality to my work, and in the playfulness was something that caught his eye. And she got to put that across during the week with Mike Douglas. Overall, again, Daytime Revolution really brings into focus what was considered at the time just a week of daytime TV was really a lot more than the contrast between John and Yoko and TV host Mike Douglas. That he even allowed this week to happen at this period of time was probably a miracle in itself. And it's interesting to see how the relationship between Douglas and Lennon develops during the week, though Douglas gets it off to an interesting start by singing Michele, basically a McCartney song. The only downside to the movie that we could see was the fact that the whole week's shows were not somehow included in the package. Rhino Records released the entire week of shows in 1998 on VHS. The full shows would have added an even fuller perspective on the film. While the Blu-ray doesn't include all the music, it does have 3 bonus music videos as extras. It's So Hard, Memphis with Chuck Berry, and Luck of the Irish. Additional music is also included throughout the film, including a beautiful rendition of Imagine by John near its end. The fact that the film manages to display the real importance of 2 young offbeat celebrities as John and Yoko were seen at the time is the reason to see this film and add it to your collection. Douglas's bravery in having them on for a week would probably be unlikely today. The fact that it worked, and as well as it did, was something that Douglas could never have imagined, and it makes this week a very memorable week in TV history. Now, more notes on that Canadian Decca tapes reel. We sent a note off to Alan Cozen, the former Beatles and classical music reporter at the New York Times, and he was doing that at the same time, by the way. Currently the co-host at our old stomping grounds of Things We Said Today, and co-author of the currently, but due to expand, 2-volume, very encyclopedic, The McCartney Legacy, about the tape. Here was his reply. He wrote, I don't really know a lot about it other than it doesn't just stand to reason that a master of the Decca audition would have been sitting in a record shop in Vancouver for a decade or at all. The argument that it sounds great and therefore must be a master doesn't really stand up to reason. It's the Decca audition. We know what it sounds like, and it has always sounded great. My best theory about what this tape is, based on what has been said about edits in some of the songs, it's a master of the Gray Market release from 1982, the one that Pete Best was behind and which, I'm sure you'll recall, had sections within various songs looped in order to extend their length. That seems plausible to me, but a master for an artificially lengthened gray market release isn't the same as a master of the Decca edition, and it does show the danger of messing with historical source materials, because the next thing we'll hear is the songs are longer than in the bootleg release, and therefore this is the master, when the exact opposite would be the case. Also, Beatle enthusiast Norman Masloff recently traveled to Vancouver, where he met up with Rob Frith, Larry Hennessy, and Doug Schober, and had a chance to listen to the tape himself. We asked him what he thought of what he heard. He said, "I don't think it's the master at all, but it is an excellent copy from somewhere. It sounds better than the versions on Anthology 1. And now for a couple of quick Beatle news briefs. It looks pretty apparent that The Who have fired Zach Starkey, Ringo's son, as their drummer. According to various reports, what led to the firing was Zach's drumming last month at the Who concert at Royal Albert Hall. His drumming was criticized by singer Roger Daltrey. Zach said he was proud of his near 30 years with the Who, filling in for who he called my godfather, Uncle Keith, and says he'll be taking time off to focus on the upcoming release of the album Domino Bones, My Mantra of the Cosmos, that he'll be making with Noel Gallagher, and that will be released in May. Zach says he's also writing an autobiography, and I can't wait to see that. And Abbey Road on the River will continue in Jeffersonville, Indiana for at least 10 more years in a lease extension made with the city and Southern Indiana Tourism, the festival announced recently. Abbey Road on the River will continue in Jeffersonville until 2035. The press release added the words "and beyond," indicating the agreement could end up being even longer. If you're looking to extend your collection, consider a box of Scaffold on Cherry Red Records. It's a box set with 4 CDs and 1 DVD of the recordings and TV appearances of the comedy group The Scaffold. The group is Roger McGough, John Gorman, and Mike McCartney, or Mike McGear as he was known in the 60s, to avoid cashing in on his brother's name. The set comes with a 64-page book with pictures and a full history that, of course, includes plenty of references to Brother Paul, but does not give a complete list of all the songs he played on with the group, and he played on several. We think The Scaffold is more for British tastes than Americans, but if you're a completist, this may be something to look into. And that's all for this time around. Thanks for listening, and if you're not already a subscriber, please join the gang. You can write to us at BeatlesNewsBriefs@gmail.com, and if you want to listen to our past shows, go to bystevemarinucci.blogspot.com, where you can binge listen to all our shows there. You can also find them on YouTube by searching for Beatles News Briefs. So until next time, this is Steve Marinucci saying,
Be seeing you.
Keep that one. Mark it fab.
One thing left to say. We'll see you next time.